All right, we are ready for Psalm 75 to 78 for our study tonight. This is in the third book, as we have outlined the books, or as they are outlined for us. We didn't do that. This one deals with the sanctuary, be the sanctuary or an allusion to it, or some principle pertaining to it, is found in nearly every one of these Psalms. And you've seen that already, and you saw that even in our study tonight. So let's go to the 75th Psalm. What type of psalm is this? Psalm of praise. Author? Asaph. And the message or subject of the psalm? All right. It's a hymn of praise. Anything else? Righteous judgment. Yeah, God is a righteous judge. Yeah, Psalm 75. God is a righteous judge. It seems to be the point. Is get ahead of ourselves to verse 2. When I choose the proper time, I will judge uprightly. In other words, God will judge righteously. He's a fair and righteous judge. Now, this is a short psalm, only 10 verses. W. Graham Scroggie said concerning this psalm, and I like what he said this psalm is important out of all proportion to its length. I like that. It is important, all out of proportion to its length, meaning that it's such a short psalm, and yet it's very, very important. Three things happen here. Starting with verses 1 to 3, there's praise to God as the righteous judge. He is the righteous judge. And though those are, that's the first stanza, because it ends with Selah, as we have seen with many of the Psalms doing that. And then you have, I've divided it into two more sections, though it is probably one more stanza. But be that as it may, let's start with verse 1. We give thanks to you, O God, we give thanks for your wondrous works. Declare that your name is near. That's an interesting phrase. We praise God, and your works declare that your name is near. And so that seems a little odd to us, but the name of God just simply stands for God. I don't think it means his name is near, but God's far. God's away from us, but his name is close. But his wondrous works declare that God is near. That's all it's saying. It's not saying something different than God, but that's a way of wording God's presence. Your name is near. His name stands for all that he is. Now, verse 2 is quite fascinating to me. When I choose the proper time, I will judge uprightly. What do you think that's saying? All right. Everybody's going to have the same standard. All right. He's going to judge uprightly. There's two phrases actually there. The latter one, I will judge uprightly, or I'll judge righteously. Let's start there. As Philip just said, he's going to judge everybody fairly by the same standard. In other words, if God judged this one by one standard and used a different standard over here, that's not fairness, is it? I require some requirement of this one, but I'll forego that over here. That's not the case at all. So God is a fair and a righteous judge. But let's look at the first phrase. God won't fail to judge. He'll just do it in his own time. Yeah, exactly. God's going to do it in his own time. When I choose the proper time, or the appointed time, someone may have a different translation of that. When I have the appointed time. Now, that makes me think of Habakkuk 2. that in doing this, that is God dealing with it in his own timetable, he may often let an issue develop into a certain crisis that is far beyond what man would have allowed to develop. In other words, and I think he's right about that man may have said, you know what, I would have pulled the trigger before now, and God may let it go on. And so quite often, maybe someone criticizes you as a parent, or maybe as a leader of some sort, in what you're doing, that you waited too long, or maybe you acted too quickly. God was also criticized on his timetable, as we saw in Habakkuk 2. But when God chooses his time, there is a proper time. God may let it fester for a while, but God will deal with it in his time. Let's get ahead of ourselves now and jump over to Psalm 77. What was the question in Psalm 77? It looks like God has forgotten. God hadn't forgotten. And that was pointing on the blessings and the goodness. Maybe God's forgotten us. No, God hadn't forgotten. Maybe God's forgotten about the evil. No, God hadn't forgotten that either. So now verse 3, the inhabitants and all the earth and all the inhabitants are dissolved. I will set its pillars firmly. What's that saying? English Standard uses an expression. The earth totters. The earth and all the inhabitants, it totters. The NET says that they dissolve in fear. I don't think that means, as perhaps it could be left if you took it literally in the New King James, that God's going to take the earth and all the inhabitants and just dissolve them and just obliterate them. But because God is a righteous judge, it causes the earth to dissolve in fear. They just melt in fear. And the earth totters and shakes. I will set its pillars firmly. Any stability is because of God, is what I'm learning at verse 3. Now, before we get any further, let me tie the occasion of this. What is the occasion of this psalm? And the answer is, we don't know. It is speculated, highly speculated, that perhaps this has to do with the Assyrian threat of Sennacherib. We don't know that for sure. But it is thought that Psalm 76 ties well with that, and it well fits the time of Assyria. But we don't know that for sure either, and we'll say more about that when we get to Psalm 76. But it may fit the Assyrian threat. So God is saying, when the time comes, I'll deal with Assyria, or I'll deal with Babylon, or whatever the case may be. There may be some connection. So what about the placement of this psalm? Why is this psalm placed right here instead of maybe being placed somewhere else? I don't know for sure, but some speculate this, that this may be placed here as an answer to some things that were worded in 74, verse 22 and 23. Arise, O God, and plead your cause. This had to do with a complaint about the enemy destroying the land. Remember, we didn't get very far into Psalm 74 last time. But perhaps this may have to do with Assyria, this may have to do with Babylon, I don't know. But whatever the case, there seems to be a complaint about the enemy destroying the land and the sanctuary. And so verse 22, plead your cause. God deal with the matter. And do not forget the voice of your enemies, verse 23. And God is saying, I'm a righteous judge, I will deal with it in my time. Make sense? And so my grandmother used to say, I don't understand why God's letting the world stand. It's gotten so wicked. There's just so much wickedness around the world. It's so wild and wicked. I don't understand why God's letting it stand. Well, that's the forbearance of God, waiting for men to repent. Romans 2. God has a different timetable than we do. Questions or comments on verses 1 to 3? 4 to 6. In that he's a righteous judge, what do we see in 4 to 6? To those that are boastful, he tells them, better not boast. And to those who are wicked, don't lift up the horn. And do not speak with a stiff neck. That is pride, arrogance. So he warns them about their wickedness, about their pride, about their boastfulness. And because exaltation is not going to come from the north or the east or the south, the east or the west or the south, because what? Verse 7, God is the judge. So what does God do as a judge? Verse 7. Yeah, he'll exalt one and he'll bring down another. And that's already been indicated how and what he will do with reference to that. Now that's interesting at verse 8, that in his hand there is a cup and the wine is red and it is fully mixed, and he pours it out. What is that about? All right, could be. Generally, when God is pouring out a cup, think of Revelation, think of Old Testament prophets. God has a cup of wrath, and he's pouring the cup of wrath out. Now, this is not literal wine that God is giving them, but it's a cup of wine, it's a cup of wrath, is what God has. But what's interesting here to me is that not only does God have this cup of wrath, surely its dregs surely its dregs, I'm reading at the end of verse 8, surely its dregs shall all the wicked of the earth drain and drink down. What's the dregs?
That's stuff in the bottom of the wine bottle that sinks down to the bottom, the impurities.
Yeah, the settlement. So what's going to come out first when you pour out? All the wine. The dreg's going to be left at the bottom. So if you pour out the sediment, what does that mean? You drink it all. Here's the idea. You're exactly right. So God has in his hand a cup of wrath, and the wicked are going to be made to drink all of it. Does that make sense? And so, God, when are you going to deal with the problem of the enemy or the wicked? And, all right, the answer is, I'm a righteous judge. I'll deal with it in the proper time, on my time schedule. And when I get ready, I'll pour out the cup of wrath, and they're going to drink all of it. They'll drink the dregs and all, the sediment and all. They're going to drink it every bit. And God will do that. Make sense? Now let's get verses 9 and 10. 9 and 10 is praise to God, for the wicked are cut off and the righteous are exalted. Exactly what verse 7 had said. So he said, I will declare forever and I will sing praises to the God of Jacob. All the horns of the wicked are cut off and the horns of the righteous will be exalted. So you say, what does it mean God's a righteous judge? Verse 10 is your commentary. It means when people are wicked, God's going to bring them down. He's going to punish them. And those that are righteous, he'll exalt. God is a righteous judge. Well, I think Scroggie is right. That psalm is important out of all proportion to its length. Would you agree? Good assessment of the psalm. Questions or comments? Practical things you learn from Psalm 75. That you take home with you and you say, this is good stuff. All right, yeah, God's timing. God takes care of things in his own time. God's got his own time schedule, and he's not on my clock. Honestly, I think all of us would have to admit there are times that we, maybe it's reading some Bible story, we think God kind of pulled the trigger kind of quick on that. I mean, they rebelled and the earth just opened up and swallowed them. Why didn't he give them some more time? God does it in his own timetable. There are other times where God's patient and allows things to go on, and I'm thinking, why didn't he pull the trigger before now? God does it in his own timetable. He's not on my timetable. I'm glad he's not. See, I'd mess it up. What else do you learn? Psalm 75. Absolutely. Be a time when the wicked are held accountable. And when God gets ready to pour out his cup of wrath, I want to make sure that I'm not made to drink any of it, but I sure don't want to have to drink all of it and get down and drink the dregs too. That's bad when you get that far. When you drink that much of the wrath of God, you're in trouble. You're in big, big trouble. All right, let's move on to Psalm 76. What type of psalm is this? All right, it is a psalm of praise. It could be classified as a psalm of thanksgiving as well. The author is obviously Asaph, and the message of the psalm All right? God is to be feared. He's known all around. Anything else? All right? God is glorious and mighty. It seems to, and that's good, that it focuses on overcoming the enemy by God's power. Some think that 76 is a sequel to 75. Maybe so. Loopholes suggest that there's not a better fit than the description of the Assyrian threat found in Isaiah 37 and 36. You might just turn over there just for a moment. Do I know for sure, or does he know for sure? Let me rephrase that. I don't know for sure that fits here. It may. I'm going to leave it at that. Does Loophole know that for sure, or did he know that for sure? And the answer to that is no, not exactly. He doesn't know that for sure. But this was the defeat of the Assyrian army, where an angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. Loophole, just for what it's worth, suggests he can't think of a case in the Old Testament that better fits this psalm than that case. Is that proof? No, it's not. But there is some occasion wherein the enemy is overcome. So here's what happens. I'm going to give you two outlines. I like perhaps the second one better. The first one here is God's known for his greatness, and it's by God who is so great that the enemies are cast down, and then there's praise and worship for God. Jensen presents two outlines, and this is one of the two. This is not his main outline. This was kind of a footnote outline, and I like it better than anything else he did on this psalm. The completeness of the overthrow, the manner of the overthrow, the reasons for the overthrow, and the result of the overthrow. I like that. So let's work through that second outline there as we go through this psalm. This may have to do with Sennacherib and the overthrow, but whatever it is, there is an enemy that has been overthrown. So let's start with this idea. If we want to blend these two together, God's known for his greatness, but that greatness is part of the reason for the completeness of the overthrow. That in Judah God is known. The name is great in Israel, in Salem or Jerusalem, also in his tabernacle, and his dwelling places in Zion. He has broken the arrows of the bow, the shield, and the sword of battle. That last phrase. In other words, here's the completeness. God has broken every shield, every spear, every arrow, every bow. God has destroyed the enemy. And so there is the completeness of this overthrow. And how could that be done? Because God is indeed this great God. Now, starting at verse 4 through verse 6, here's the manner of the overthrow. What do you see? Well, God is greater and more glorious and excellent than the mountains of prey. The stout-hearted were plundered. What else? Yeah, the men of war, the mighty men, were unable to use their hands. I take that to be they were paralyzed with fear. And if Loophole be correct about the timing of this, that picture in Isaiah 37 of 185,000 being slaughtered, I don't know about you, but if I was in that army and I saw 185,000 be killed, I would tremble in fear and probably couldn't lift my hand out of fear. I'd be scared to death that I'm next, and the rest of us are going to get killed as well. So that none of them could raise their hand. And then it says at verse 6 that at your rebuke, this because God was involved, both the chariot and the horse were cast into a deep sleep. Now that's not literal because a chariot can't sleep. But it's like their tools of war, this fell asleep. They're unable to function. Again, paralyzed perhaps in fear. So what was the manner? Because God caused it. So here's the completeness of the overthrow. The manner of it is God instilled fear in them, and through that fear that God instilled, the army of God was able to overcome. Now let's go to 7 to 9. Let's talk about the reason for the overthrow. What was the reason for that? Little short section here. All right? Yeah, because God ought to be feared. But I'm interested at the end of verse 7, and who may stand in your presence when once you are angry. So the reason for the overthrow, the enemy had made God angry. And so why were they overthrown? They had, not because Israel is more powerful, not because Israel has a smarter army. They were overthrown because they had stirred the anger of God. Now, why did they stir the anger of God? Let's get down to verse 9. You tell me. Verse 9. Yeah, they were oppressive to the people of God. So, in answer, so you say, if we're going to tell somebody who's not read 7 to 9, what does 7 to 9 say? What it just said was that they oppressed God's people and that angered God. That's why God overthrew them. If it's Assyria, that's why. If it was Babylon, that's why. Whoever this was, it doesn't matter to understand the song. But if it be Assyria, they were oppressive to the people of God, so God overthrew them. That angered God. And so God overthrew them. It's interesting to me, this short psalm, only 12 verses. Notice that God is to be feared, verse 7, and the earth feared and was still. And then we're going to see that verse 11, God ought to be feared. The fear of God is mentioned 3 times in that context. Now let's talk about the result of the overthrow, 10 through 12. What was the result of this overthrow? God's going to be praised in a number of ways. And verse 10 is a controversial verse. I don't mean by that it's just extremely complicated. It's just there's some question among commentators which direction it's going, and I'm wondering why it couldn't go in more than one direction. In this sense, surely the wrath of man shall praise you. In other words, there is a sense in which those that were the enemies of God would bring praise to God. The question is that voluntary or is it involuntary? And perhaps it could be partially both. How could that work? Well, it may be that by them pressing against God and His people, that gives an occasion for God to show His power. And that shows the praise and the glory of God. So the more they oppress the people of God, the more they push against God, the more they fight against God, that gives God a chance to show His power. Okay, that works. Or it may be that they come to recognize and voluntarily praise God because this God is a powerful God. Look at our powerful army, and we could not stand against the armies of the people of God, against Israel, so they praise God, voluntarily do that. That may be the case. Others have argued that this suggests the enemies will ultimately submit to God one way or the other. And that ultimately does happen. But is that what this psalm is talking about? I'm not sure. But there's some sense, and we're focusing on the result of the overthrow. The result is God is praised even by the action of the enemy. Either they succumb and they recognize God, or they don't succumb and their defeat is an occasion for God to be praised. All right, let's move on. Verse 11 and 12. What do you see? Yeah, make your vows and pay them. Let all who are around him bring presents to him who ought to be feared. I don't know of another place where that phrase is used. I'm not saying it's not, I'm just unaware of that. There are plenty of passages that imply God ought to be feared, but that exact phrase, who ought to be feared, that's an interesting phrase. So let people come and bring things to God. In other words, let them praise and honor God who ought to be feared. And he should cut off the spirit of the princes. He is awesome to the kings of the earth. So the result of the overthrow is God's recognized for who he is and God's praise. Make sense? Now, I like that Jensen's outline there, that one in the box. I like that better. It gets the concept, the completeness of the overthrow, the manner, the reasons, and the result. Gets to the heart of that psalm. Questions, comments, practical things. What do you learn from Psalm 76? Yes. He's going to be driven. We didn't talk much about the second part of verse 10, with the remainder of wrath, you shall gird yourself. Not sure what all that encompasses, but it seems to be that as God pours out his wrath against the enemy, whatever remainder of wrath that he has, he girds himself to deal with those who are the wicked. It's like wrath is like a garment that he can put on, or a tool that he can strap on like a sword. And so with the remainder of wrath, you gird yourself and you put that wrath on, and he plows on to deal with those who are wicked. Practical things you learn from that psalm before we go to 77. All right, let's go to Psalm 77. What type of psalm is this? Yeah, it seems to be it does end up praising God, but it seems to be a lamentation. There is a bewailing of something that we'll talk about what that is. Message? It seems like God has forgotten his people. Key verse, we don't give this for every psalm, but if you wanted to look for a verse that would tell us that's the point, look at verse 9. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has God forgotten his people? And the answer is, obviously, no. And the psalmist will tell us that himself before he's through. So let's work through this. And you say, we're never going to get through Psalm 78. You're right. I mainly want to focus on a section of Psalm 78 and then hit in a running fashion the history which you are familiar with. Psalm 77. Two points here. There is a problem, and then there's the comfort. The problem is it seems like God has forgotten his people. And then his comfort that he is based upon God's past mercies. So let's see what we can accomplish here in 77. He starts off with this cry to God. I cried out to God with my voice. And to God with my voice. And he gave ear to me. And notice he mentions in the day of trouble, verse 2, I stretched out. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. But I'm interested at verse 3. The occasion seems to be some deep, deep trouble. Some deep trouble. That I remembered God and was troubled. I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. In other words, I was deeply, deeply, deeply troubled. And so I cried to God over this problem. Now, let's go to verse 4 through verse 6. After saying he cried to God, he said, I was troubled. He was troubled so bad, verse 4 says, he couldn't sleep. That you held my eyelids open. I don't think he's saying, God, you caused that, but what God either allowing this problem or not immediately dealing with the problem means I'm not able to sleep because I'm suffering through this problem. And so I was troubled. I was so troubled that I cannot speak. Have you ever been so troubled you couldn't talk about the problem? Well, the psalmist is saying that's the way it was. Now look at verse 6. I call to remembrance my song in the night. Verse 5 had mentioned the days of old. I think what he's talking about, I remembered back to better times. And this is part of what made it hard. And then at the end of verse 6, he said, I meditate within my heart and my spirit makes diligent search. In other words, I take it to mean I made comparison. I'm looking at my trouble now and I look back to better times. Things were a lot better before. I'm in deep, deep trouble. And I'm aching and hurting. Now here's the reason I was troubled, 7 to 9. What does he say? This gets to the heart of what his question is. I began to wonder, has God forgotten? You see, here's what I thought. I thought Has his mercy ceased forever? Verse 8. Has his promise failed forever? Verse 9 is the key. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he shut up his tender mercies? So I wondered, I've had problems in the past, and God answered my prayers, and he delivered me, and I've got problems now, and has God forgotten? And then he turns and talks about the comfort. Now, verse 10, depending on if you've read 4 commentaries on this, they probably went in 2 different directions at verse 10. I want to take verse 10 with the second part, others take it with the first part. Be that as it may, we'll look at that. And your translations differ on that. And I said, this is my anguish, but I remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. Some take it that he's still talking about verse 9, that this is what causes me such anguish is I remember when God used to answer my prayers and God blessed me before, and I'm wondering, where is he now? Others take it that he's saying, this was my anguish, and so consequently I remembered, and here's what I remember, starting at verse 11. And I've worded it here. He admits his thinking's been wrong because he changes his focus. Let's see if we see a change in thought. That I'll remember the years of the Most High. Now, verse 11, I'll remember the works of the Lord. Surely I'll remember your wonders of old, and I will meditate on all your works and talk of your deeds. Seems to be a shift in focus that I got to thinking about this, and consequently, I just thought I needed to think on the deeds of God, the good deeds of God, because that's what he does at the end of the psalm. I got to thinking about that. Now look at verse 13. His comfort is found in God. Your way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Some translations take the word sanctuary and just simply translate it holiness or holy. In other words, God's way is holy. In other words, it seems like the psalmist is saying, I got to thinking about it and I realized, God, your way is holy and your way is right. And when I thought about that, I changed my mind. This reminds me of Psalm 55. Remember the change of mind in Psalm 55? Same kind of concept. Here, different issue, but same kind of concept. So verse 13, who is so great as our God? You are the God who works wonders and has declared the strength among the people. And you have with your arm redeemed your people. The Son. I got to thinking about your strength and your power and your might. No, God hadn't forgotten his people. So 16 to 20 talks about what? Yeah, he's just focusing on what God did in the past and focused on the Red Sea, as Kevin just mentioned, the parting of the waters and the clouds and the skies, the sound and the thunders and the lightning. God's power was demonstrated. Now notice verse 20. This is a key. When you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. What he's saying is that when we see God's guidance, things begin to clear up. You see, I thought when I was in deep, deep trouble and I was in deep anguish that maybe God's forgotten. I thought God's forgotten about mercy and showing kindness. And then I got to thinking about the power of God, and I got to thinking on what God did for Israel in the parting of the sea and the guiding them through the waters by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And when I begin to see how God leads and guides, things begin to clear up. Does that make sense? Things begin to clear up. I have a different view. Have you ever, we're about to leave this because I want to get to Psalm 78. Have you ever been bothered by something, and the more you thought about it and thought about scriptures relating to that, you had a whole different view and things look clearer now? That's what the psalmist just did. Practical things you learn from Psalm 77. Absolutely, absolutely. If he'll take care of them in Egypt, if he'll take care of his people in Babylon, he'll take care of his people today. Good point. Psalm 78, what type of psalm do we have? It is a historical psalm. It's not the first historical section, but the first full historical psalm. It's the history of Israel from Egypt to David. 2 points, and that is the introduction to the history, a study of history, and then the study of history itself. Now, here's the point of the psalm. It is not merely, let's talk about history for history's sake. This happened first and this happened second. In fact, just a mental note, this psalm is not written in true chronology. If you got a little confused reading it, I thought this event at this verse happened before that one. Yeah, it is not intended to be chronology. It is intended to tell a story. And the story is, they forgot God. It's interesting that followed on the psalm that said, has God forgotten us? No, but we often forget God. So let's work through this psalm. And I said we won't get through it all. Didn't think I would. But Scroggie said concerning this psalm, there is an immorality of forgetfulness. And he indeed is correct. It is immoral. So let's see what happens here. There's the plea on the part of the psalmist for people to come and listen and hear and listen to God. So I'm going to forego that because I want to get to 5 through 11. That's where I want us to camp. We're going to spend most of our time with 5 through 11. Now let me footnote. You might make a marginal note. Do you remember the passage in Judges 2? After the generation of Joshua, there arose a generation after them that knew not God. Have you ever wondered why they didn't know God? That text didn't tell us. There arose a generation after them that didn't know God. There's a passage that helps us understand why they didn't know God. You know where that passage is? Psalm 78, exactly. Psalm 78. Key right here is 5 through 11. Those of you who've read ahead, the next generation didn't know God because the first generation did not teach them as they should. Does that make sense? All right, let's work through that. Starting at verse 5. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded the fathers. So in other words, God gave a law. Here's my point. Look at the screen. God gave his word to be taught. All right. That they should make it known to their children. This generation teach it to the next generation. That the generation to come might know them. The children who are yet to be born. That they may arise and declare them to their children. So the first generation teaches it to the next, and the second generation teaches it to the third to the fourth, and on down the line. That they should set their hope in God, and, look at verse 7, you might underline, not forget the works of God. Judges 2:10 said they did. Psalm 78 is telling me why. Make sense? Notice the connection between not forgetting the works and keeping his commandments. Show me somebody that doesn't keep the commandments, and I'll show you somebody that's forgot about God. And they said, I remember God. I hadn't forgotten. No, you have. You forgot about God. God said you forgot him. This context says so. All right. Now then, 8 through 11, what happened in history? They actually did forget God. Notice it, verse, you might underline some of these expressions. And not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation that did not set their heart aright and whose spirit was not faithful. And then he identifies Ephraim and the case with Ephraim, who was strong, and yet they didn't keep the covenant, and they forgot, verse 11, his works and his wonders which he had shown. Now, some suggest, maybe this is I believe Jensen suggests that this may be, the occasion may be when the sanctuary was moved from Shiloh. May be the occasion, and that's speculation on his part. Now, that's the point I want you to see, verses 5 through 11. God gave his word to be taught to the next generation, and when that doesn't happen, they forget about God. Now, the rest of this is history. It's a historical psalm, starting with the deliverance from Egypt down to David. That's where it stops. So what's the point of this? To say, let me tell you the story and so you know your history? No. The point is, you tell me, that they forgot about God. It's over and over the story of them forgetting God. And so the storyline, let's forget biblical history. If I were teaching American history, one of the things we'd say over and over in teaching history would be, history repeats itself. And it did, and it does. So let's watch for key words here. Starting at verse 12 to 14, talks about them coming out of Egypt. Then, beginning at verse 15 to 53, that's a large section, there was the wilderness wanderings. What happened during the wilderness? Look at verse 17. They sinned against him more. They rebelled against him. Verse 17. Drop down to 22. If you don't underline any other verses tonight in this psalm, or the rest of the psalm, 22 and 32. Because they did not believe in God. Wow, that's a strong statement. That's abrasive. While they were in the wilderness, they didn't believe in God. Do you think they didn't believe there was a God? Is that what it's saying? I don't think that means that. What do it mean they didn't believe in God? They didn't obey Him. Didn't obey Him is the idea. Drop down to verse 32. Despite, verse 24, God gave them manna and sent the quail. Verse 27, verse 32, in spite of this, they still sinned and did not believe in His wondrous works. In other words, they saw He gave us manna, He gave us quail, He gave us water from the rock, and they still didn't accept Him. Oh, they believed there was a God. They just didn't obey Him. And so this is the storyline. The story is being told that this is a history of a rebellious nation. That's the point of this psalm. All right? Now, you might bracket off verses 38, 39, and 38 and 39, those two verses, is a statement of God's mercy. God did not stir all the wrath that He could have stirred toward them. God didn't utterly wipe them out. He had mercy on His people, despite the fact that they were rebellious and they forgot about Him. Look at verse 42, you might underline, and they did not remember His power. This is the storyline. They didn't remember God. All right, let's go further. Now, we've already got them in the wilderness, but then He comes back in verse 43 talking about the deliverance from Egypt. I told you it's not in true chronology, not intended to be. It's just trying to tell a storyline. Now let's come down to Canaan, starting at verse 54. We've got them in the wilderness. Now we've got them in Canaan. Verse 54 to 56. Look at verse 57. But they turned their back and acted unfaithful like their fathers. Verse 58, they built the high places and carved images. Then down to 67 to 69, God finally rejected the northern kingdom and accepted the southern kingdom as the one, that's the kingdom through whom the Messiah would come, and favored them for a while and then finally took them. But that's not part of the storyline here. And then God chose David. And that's where it stops. Because that's all that's needed, number one, is the rest of the history not developed at this point, that the psalm may be written. But furthermore, that's not needed to make his point of they forgot about God. Make sense? It's a storyline, they forgot God. They forgot God. Now, if we don't get anything else from Psalm 78, I hope you'll remember verses 5 through 11. God gave His word that it might be taught to the next generation, that generation teach it to the next generation. And all it takes is one link in the chain to be broken and the chain's gone. That's all it takes. And so if you would like for your great-grandchildren to know the Lord, make sure your children know the Lord. Because if your children don't know the Lord, your grandchildren probably won't know anything about the Lord, and your great-grandchildren will never even hear of the Lord. That's a sad but true statement. Make sense? Time is gone. Practical things. Let's get one or two in, and then he'll go ring the bell. Absolutely. He's done everything he could do, and they still forgot about God. One more practical lesson. Anybody? All right. They can believe in God, but we may not believe God Himself, and that was their problem. Psalm 79 next time through 82.